Everybody, Bobby here from the GM table, and today we're going to cover the 5 key parts to really make any adventure on the fly. Okay, so like I said, in at least my toolbox, there's really only 5 parts that once you get this concept down, you can run or make up just about any adventure on the fly. And this is heavily based off of the concept of the 5-room dungeon. If you're not familiar with that, we're going to do a quick rundown of that. Then I'm going to go into how I took that concept and broke it down into essential parts of storytelling instead of just within the confines of a dungeon. And then at the very end, if you're still watching, we're going to cover some examples of each of the 5 pieces and how you can mix and match and modify, kind of break the rules once you know them to do really anything narratively. Okay, so the 5-room dungeon, if you're not familiar with this, honestly, I'm not going to say where it originated from because it's gone around so much. I can't confidently tell you where, but I'm going to try and do research. If I find something, I'll throw it down there as long as I can cite it and confirm that's where it originated from. But it basically goes like this. Room 1 is your entrance or guardian. Room 2 is a puzzle or role play. Room 3 is a trick, trap, or other setback. Room 4 is the big battle or climax. Yeah, it's not the end, because room 5 is your reward or revelation. There's a whole thing of that. I'm going to link to where I got my PDF breakdown of this, which is a much more detailed analysis and tool for doing this in the 5-room dungeon, if that interests you. But we're going to go a step further. We're going to go into actually making this the 5 parts of an adventure. And we're going to rename these now we're going broader. So part 1 is your opening action. Part 2 will be your open-ended problem. Part 3 will be raising the stakes. Part 4 is your big finish. And part 5 is one of 2 pieces. So technically it's 6 parts, but you'll never use both at the same time. And it's either you're going to use the wrap-up or the loose thread. Now at this point, I've just said names of things. So we're going to go a little deeper. The opening action. This is here to get things rolling at the table. This can be a lot of stuff, but basically it's an opening, either combat or chase, stuff like that. We're going to get into that into the examples portion, but this is the opening so that you can hit the ground running. We don't want an hour and a half of slow build up till something finally happens. We're still going to have that, or potentially have it, depending on the type of game you want, but you still want to start with something that hits hard, especially if you're doing a con game or a one shot or something where you need first impressions. But even then, we're not gaming every day. It's been a week, maybe a month, maybe multiple months since we've sat at the table. You and all your friends are now digitally, and you want to start with something that is engaging and intense, and that is your opening action. This is incredibly important in a lot of script writing too, which is where a lot of my sensibilities come from. Now, part 2 is the meat of your adventure. This is the biggest part. This is the open-ended problem. I kind of really don't like that in the 5-room dungeon, they say the puzzle, because the problem with a puzzle is, and the problem with puzzles in tabletop games in general, is typically there's only one way to solve it, and it's 100% dependent on if your players can figure out the solution to the puzzle that's being given to their characters. It can create a bit of a disconnect. Sometimes players are smarter than their characters. A lot of times, characters should be smarter than their players. All kinds of stuff like that. So in this case, it's more the open-ended problem. This is great for mysteries, but MacGuffin adventures, anything where you're going to be traveling. This is we have now set up what the problem is, and it's just wide open for the players to figure out how they want to handle it. And this is where you just let them roam. On a more railroad adventure, this might be much smaller, where we can focus on the other parts. But I tend to do sandboxy, open-ended improv-y adventures, so this is the meat of my game. When we get into the examples, this is where you can really throw in great mysteries and investigations, which are my kind of games. But this is the area where you get to focus on role play, and you get to focus on discovery and creative problem solving. Now, the biggest thing for this is it is the open-ended. Have potential solutions, but be willing to have your players come up with solutions you didn't think of. This is the magic of tabletop RPGs, if you ask me. This is where it really shines and what makes this hobby very special. So by having the problem open-ended, you can really do that. But moving on, part 3 is raising the stakes. And this is a very, very important tool. This can be combat. This might be a social interaction. But basically what this is raising the stakes is typically the reward, quote unquote, reward for figuring out the open-ended problem. This is where the players know they are now on the right path. But the little secret to this is where you also get to control pacing. If the open-ended problem is taking too long, if your players are really stumped, you can raise the stakes anyways, because maybe they might not be directly on the right path, but the villain thinks they're getting too close. Or if the villain's already an established enemy, the villain attacks them. Or maybe what they're trying to prevent happens, or something related to it happening, letting them know that the big thing is about to happen. This is where you can take that slower pace of part 2 and turn it off whenever you want. You go to raising the stakes and you go, now we're kicking into the 3rd act. This is where you signify stuff's going to start. This could be combat, this could be a chase, it could be social, it can be anything. When we get into the options and the variations, you'll see that. But the biggest thing about this is where we have officially ended the open end problem, and there is now either a solution or they've reached an end to it. Along with that, this can be, maybe if they're going down the wrong path of the open-ended problem, this is when you definitively show and prove you were going down the wrong path. Give them a consequence for that, because it's not, oh, it didn't matter whether or not you got it, we were going this way. Give them a consequence for going down the wrong path in a way where they know definitively, crap, we did this wrong, we screwed up, there are now consequences. But if you craft those consequences well, it'll also hopefully give them enough to go, but now we know where to go. And that's where part 3, raising the stakes, should be just this shoot straight in to the big finish. It should point them right to where they want to go. Now, granted, it's a role-playing game. They could choose not to go there. That's its own problem. But this should give a nice big glowing sign on what to do or how to get to the big finish. And the big finish is the obvious one. It's the big boss fight. It's the big social scene. It's whatever you want the big showcase of the adventure to be. If you're a very combat heavy DM or GM, this might be where a lot of your game is. This is the big intricate combat if you have one. If you have a big set piece or something like that for your adventure, this is where you'll likely want to put that. It's, again, the big finish. Part 5 is the ending. This part really determines whether or not you're doing a one-shot, whether you're doing an ongoing game. If it's an ongoing game, whether or not it's episodic or serialized, stuff like that. The wrap-up is if everything's done. You give them their rewards, they get the fruits of their labor. This is a good time where if you're doing an ongoing game and you want a time jump, you then get to time jump, stuff like that. But if it's a serialized game, if it's one where you don't want everything to be done, it can also be the loose end, which is where defeating the big bad or somehow completing the big finish leads to the hook that'll bring into next session's adventure. And this is how you get serialized storytelling. This is why Spider-Man ran for over 60 years and never stopped unless they wanted it to. Now, I will say, don't always do a loose end even in serialized. It's going to take some training, and we'll probably do a video about this too at some point. But even if you're going ongoing, sometimes you still want those ends, because on the loose end, you're going to likely be raising the stakes on the next one. It goes up and up and up. And eventually, how do you top yourself? Well, you reach the end, then you time jump, you give a chance for the stakes to reset, and we start back at part 1 next session. Finally, we're getting into, I've touched on this constantly because it's just how I explain things, some examples, because this setup can be used for dungeon crawls. I mean, the 5-room dungeon, but it can also be used for mysteries, for MacGuffins, for research, for just stop the big bad while there's a countdown. There's so much you can do. Some examples for part 1 for your opening action. The easiest is do an in media res. This is where you start in the middle of action from something else. This isn't necessarily action from last session. That's a cliffhanger. In media res can get into the second example I have written down, which is wrapping up another adventure, wrapping up the last adventure that was off screen. James Bond notoriously does this, where you open up the movie on him doing something really cool, which is like the climax to an adventure you never saw. So you get all the fun of the climax, all that action, but typically it's going to be smaller than your climax because that adventure was off screen, so it can't be as cool as the one we're seeing. But it gives the sense that things are constantly happening, that the world is going on even when we're not at the table. But the biggest thing is it gives the player something with energy to do. This can easily be combat, but it can also be chasing down a target. You don't necessarily have to directly open on this, but it can go, oh, we have a murder. Here's the main person of interest. And we already know who it is. We know where he is. So now you have to go get him, and he flees. All of a sudden, you have a chase scene towards the beginning. This should happen within the first 10 or so minutes of your session. You really want to get this going. But start with that. This can also be negotiating deals if you're in a more diplomatic game. Now, the open-ended problem part 2, I already did some examples, but this can be solving a mystery, finding someone or something that's missing or needs to be uncovered. This is your MacGuffin. Questioning NPCs, doing things like whodunits, doing research into figuring out what you need or where you need to go to get towards your goal. All of that falls into the open-ended problem. The big thing about that is it's open-ended. You have that part 3 to cap it whenever you need, but this is where I love to go, here's your problem, players, and then sit back, let them do their thing. This way, players write like 90% of your adventure. Just adapt with it, go on the fly, look at any of our other improv videos. We're going to have more coming soon. And that's where you really handle that. Then again, the part 3, raising the stakes. This is where, all right, they think they know where the big bad is and they have to invade a hideout. Boom. Also, we have a little combat, little setup. Again, it's not the big finale, but it turns out the hideout was right. Boom, they've raised the stakes. It's like, this isn't this. The big bad's actually even bigger. Oh, we've raised the stakes. They can also be ambushed. Again, this is the tool you have for the GM. If your open-ended problem is taking too long, just have the villain ambush them instead of them ambush the villain. This also counts not just combat ambushes, but falling into a trap. If they're setting up a trap for the villain, Scooby-Doo style, but at the end, it wasn't just Mr. Curmudgeon off in the corner, but it turned out to actually be a monster. No, now we have the big bad and the big finale fight, but they're still saying the trap. That's still them raising the stakes. And this is where you start to really set the tone for how dangerous part 4 is going to be. Now, part 4, real self-explanatory, big bad villain fight. A very important social conflict can matter. You can do a courtroom trial as part 4. You can just have negotiations with a noble, which will make or break a country's economy. Whatever your game tends to need, the concept stays the same, that this is the big moment of your adventure. And then finally, part 5, again, if you're doing the wrap up, or even if you want to give a little bit of rewards, you have your reward side of things. And the obvious is treasure, but you can also give medals, titles, property, promotions. And the one I love that I'm even really bad is just give them vacation. Give them peace for a while. What you did means your life isn't crazy. And then you get to let them epilogue a bit, either a time jump or actually wrapping up the game if it is a finale, because they succeeded and they won. But the threats, the open threads, the loose threads, obvious one, there's an even bigger bad behind the big bad they took out. You can have the big bad got away and he's going to go do something again. Things like that. But the more interesting ones are things like the hero's actions from solving this adventure have consequences that now start to unfold, which creates a new problem. They can have, maybe they defeated the big bad, but the things he did still have a lasting impact in the players' lives or in the world at large. And how do you deal with that? Which leads to, again, more adventures. Now, the final piece where you get to completely break this down is these are the 5 parts. But unlike the 5-room dungeon, you don't have to go 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. Some of these really matter. 1 is your opening. 3 goes to 4, but maybe 2 goes to 3, which goes to another 2, which goes to a 3, till you get to 4. You can loop them, you can mix them. You can have 2 different open-ended problems. These are the 5 parts, but you can use the same parts multiple times and start really toying with that. And that is the alchemy of GMing. There isn't really a magic bullet for how you can do that all the time. But if you get the 5 parts down and you get comfortable with them, you can then start screwing with the formula. And before you know it, you can come up with any adventure, any story, basically on the fly with very little prep. And I'll catch you guys next week. That's it for this week's episode. But if you want to catch even more, we have live episodes every Tuesday with Tales from the Frontier and every Saturday with Savage Star Wars over on our Twitch channel, twitch.tv/GMTable. Also, as always, you can catch episodes a week or even more early over on our Patreon, patreon.com/GMTable. If that doesn't suit you and you still want to help support the channel, we have a brand new merch store in the link down below with all kinds of mugs, t-shirts, mouse pads, all that cool stuff with Wild the Wild Die, table flip shirts, all of that. Check it out below. Anyways, we'll catch you guys next time. Bye.